Now, it just so happens that during Jackson's presidency, a relatively young man from France, Alexis de Tocqueville, came to the United States with the official purpose of looking at um, the prison reform movement underway in the United States. And you can see on the left, you can see de Tocqueville, what he looked like, and on the right, you can see uh, the red the red lines indicate his travels in the United States, and he did his job. He went to different prisons and and looked at how things were operating there. And we'll be looking at prison reform ourselves down the line. But what really fascinated him was democracy, just the phenomenon of democracy, which is basically unknown in Europe. You're still dealing primarily with monarchies. Um, and, here you're at the other end of the spectrum. And de Tocqueville believed that democracy was the wave of the future, that he was seeing in the United States a phenomenon that was eventually going to find its way to Europe and indeed the rest of the world. And in 1835, I got back to France. In 1835, he published a book called Democracy in America. It was originally published in French, of course, but very quickly translated into English. And it is remarkably perceptive. And it is still, read today. And if we're in a different course and had sort of a more advanced course and had more time and this kind of thing, I'd probably have you read at least an abridged version of Democracy in America. But for now, I'm going to just show you some quotations from Democracy in America. And then after this, there is a short video on Democracy in America that I want you to watch. But here are some quotes. This is interesting. He says, the Americans are scarcely more virtuous than others, but they are infinitely more enlightened. I speak of the masses, I speak of the common men, than any other people I know. The body of people who have understanding of public affairs, knowledge of the laws and of precedents, feeling for the well understood interests of the nation, and the faculty to understand them is greater there, America, than in any other place in the world. Now, this really, would have been good news for the founders because they would not have thought that common men or common people could understand the issues of the day um, and talk about them in an intelligent kind of way. But if you look at the newspapers of the day, they're really sort of like extended editorial sheets. They didn't actually contain a whole lot of news, but they contained a whole lot of political commentary. And these newspapers were read very closely. And in different cities, they would have basically a Whig newspaper and a Democratic newspaper. But people read these things assiduously, and of course, they read them with the idea that hey, there are policies that politicians are promoting, that I either want to see enacted into law or that I don't want to see enacted into law. So there was a real sense that their vote mattered, and therefore it made sense for them to understand the issues of the day. And it would be nice to believe that this sentiment would still apply in the 21st century, but honestly, it just doesn't. Even people who are political junkies basically know talking points. They don't really think in a reflective kind of way about the issues of the day. They sort of parrot what they hear on MSNBC or CNN or Fox News or what have you. And then there, of course, a lot of Americans are sort of just checked out. They're either not interested in politics or they're just sort of weary of the hyperpartisanship. But you really can't say that you have an informed electorate in the way that de Tocqueville observed and was so impressed by. Here's another quote, and this really gets at the heart of what goes on in democracy in America because sort of a key issue that de Tocqueville identifies and wrestles with is the idea of the tyranny of the majority. So he has this here, the people is always right. That is the dogma of the republic, just as the king can do no wrong is the religion of monarchic states. And then he talks about, a conversation he had a couple of days ago with Mr. Washington Smith. And Mr. Washington Smith told me yesterday that almost all the crimes in America were due to the abuse of alcoholic drinks. And he wasn't kidding. There was a major temperance movement that got underway during this period because people were just public drunkenness and domestic violence as a result of drunkenness was really just out of control. And so so Washington Smith says, almost all the crimes in America were due to the abuse of alcoholic drinks. And then he said, well, okay, well, why don't you put a duty on brandy? Basically, why don't you make brandy more, expensive, and by extension, why don't you make whiskey more extension and this more expensive, and so forth and so on? He said, our legislators have often thought about it. He answered, but they're afraid of a revolt. And besides, the members who voted a law like that would be very sure of not being reelected, the drinkers being in a majority, and temperance, that is to say, restrictions on drink or teetotalers, whatever, unpopular. And by the way, this temperance movement would actually gain strength later on in the 19th century as people saw what a major social problem it was. But of course, they hadn't reached that point just yet. But notice that you've got policymakers who think that, hey, it'd be a good idea to do something legally to restrain this abuse of alcoholic drinks, but we don't dare do it because we get voted out of office if we tried. Then, this I find interesting. One of the things that he says is just, I have been, um, let's see, I have been, I have been almost, I've almost got proof that all the enlightened classes are opposed to General Jackson. That's President, Andrew Jackson. But the people holds to him, and he has numbers in his favor. So here's something else too. A lot of Jackson's power, comes from the support of the common men of the country. This grip on common men enables him to fend off the Nicholas Biddles of the world and the John C. Calhouns of the world and so forth. This is what enables him to prevail. And then finally, and I think this is where I want to end, but this is really kind of tragic. There were only 4 states, and they're all in New England, where African Americans were allowed to vote, and you could be a free African American, and you could own, you could own a store, a manufacturer, you could have a substantial amount of wealth, and you could pay taxes, on that wealth. And of course, if when you're doing, when you're importing goods, you're paying tariffs or customs duties or whatever you want to call them. So it's not a problem for you as a free black to pay taxes. But in only 4 states in the Union were you allowed to vote. And this right to vote was kind of theoretical. So he said, yesterday also, another Mr. Smith, a very respected Quaker, told me the Negroes have the right to vote at elections, but they cannot go to the poll without being ill-treated. And so Tocqueville says, well, and why is the law not carried out on their behalf? And he answered me, the laws have no force with us when public opinion does not support them. Now, the people is imbued with very strong prejudices against the Negroes, and the magistrates feel that they have not the strength to enforce laws which are favorable to the latter. So once again, you have a tyranny of the majority. You have free African Americans who legally have the right to vote, but don't dare go to the polls because they're going to be harassed, they're going to be ill-treated, they could be roughed up. It's just something as a practical matter they cannot do because the majority of whites, basically prevent them from doing it. And this tyranny of the majority is such that even the law, cannot protect the right of African Americans to actually vote.